Yeah, and so of course that brings us to Rob's book. But first, I want to I want to loop back a little bit, right? So because I think that oftentimes, talking about that initial anti-slavery mass movement emerging, which I guess is first expressed in the anti-slavery, well, as a mass movement, right? I mean, I guess first there's the anti-slavery wing of the Whigs, but then, like what you're talking about, Matt, is really then the emergence of the Republicans, and how that relates to some of this stuff that would come up later about labor and industrial capitalism. I think might seem a little unclear in a couple of different directions, or there are a couple of ways that maybe you can speak to that people could get this wrong, because on the one hand, there's the sort of idea that like it kind of doesn't, right? Like that if you want to just be like a really schematic Marxist about this, right? That's the you've got your bourgeois revolution that's maybe being fulfilled by the Civil War, and then that creates the possibility for something better, but that's like the only real relationship between those two things. And then on the other hand, I think there's kind of a tradition on parts of the left of like quoting some like Abraham Lincoln comments about labor and capital and stuff in a slightly misleading, out of context way. That
Little sermons in socialism by Abraham Lincoln. Did a little pamphlet distributed by the Socialist Party in like 1910. It had a bunch of these gems. Yeah.
Yeah. So where does Lincoln's Republican Party? I mean, if you're like, all right, we accept that probably in context, when he talks about labor and capital and stuff, he's actually not meaning to endorse, a proto-Marxist account of exploitation. But it's also not true that, sort of concerns about the welfare of industrial workers are foreign to this movement and its stated motivations.
I'd love to hear Alex's take on this, but I can go first just from less about the economics, but maybe I can give a slightly historiographical version of that distinction, because I think there are arguments among historians about how to understand this. One way to put it is, just given the two speakers who've been featured thus far, how do you explain basically the gap between Seward and Stewart? How do you get from a anti-slavery Republican Party that it seems to sort of embody a lot of the sort of the demand for a certain kind of positive liberty, or at least a critique of slavery's violation of that of that understanding of freedom, and then to a party that in the era of Ira Stewart in the Gilded Age period becomes the kind of most remorseless advocate of capital in the country. And then becomes the most enthusiastic capitalist party in the history of the world, as has been said. So yeah, I think historiographically there are basically as often is the case, there's arguments that emphasize continuity and arguments that emphasize change. And I think you don't have to be a kind of a total a totally vulgaroid Marxist to say there were elements of the, to trace a direct line from the kind of like bourgeois critique of slavery in the antebellum period that did flavor, many anti-slavery critiques of bondage to the Gilded Age Republican Party. I mean, that's basically Eric Foner's interpretation in his classic work on pre-war Republican ideology. Now, I think it's multivocal, so I don't think he's a hardliner on this. I think there are lots of things you can read in Foner, much as there are lots of things you can read in the sources. But my view is that, that this is a story of change, not continuity. This is a story of an ideology that clearly contained the seeds for many different forests. One that Alex has described very well in his book that does feed into labor republicanism in the late 19th century. But sure, that also contained, the seeds of, bourgeois, the sort of laissez-faire capitalism of the Gilded Age. But that what really happened is, the political economy of the nation changed between 1856 and 1880, or even 1876. And the rise of finance capital, there are in Wall Street, not unrelated to the sort of need to finance the war, the kind of growing importance of industry and the sort of and the power of the the industrialist class, and the kind of the truth that in some ways Lincoln's vision of this kind of democratic republican in effect republic of petty proprietors was already out of date by the 1850s. No man should have to should work a wage for life, Lincoln says, which is quite a bold statement. We would love to hear Bernie Sanders say that. That's far to the left of any contemporary on pure economics. Arguably, that's far to the left of any contemporary left figure. And yet, it was clearly not true by in reality. And it became even less true in aspiration, but according to the policy of the Republican Party in power, even as soon as the 1860s. So there's a lot of part of my problem is I'm going to stop hemming and hawing here because I haven't actually carried that story with my own research through. This is part of my life's work now, is to try to figure out how this change happened. And first I have to write the book on the 50s, then I have to write the book on the 60s, then I have to write a book on the 70s. It's going to take a long time. But I think fundamentally this is a story of transformation and change, and a lesson that, that having a kind of the right ideological fusion for one moment doesn't necessarily, grant you a victory in another historical era. That's, most broadly what I would say, rather than, they were sheepdogged and poisoned from the beginning with this kind of evil germ of libertarianism that, doomed them, in the long run. But I suspect Alex agrees broadly, but I'd love to hear his take.
I mean, I agree almost entirely with what Matt says. I think that Lincoln articulates different ways of thinking about freedom depending on his audience. The most famous one is him speaking to a bunch of farmers in Wisconsin. So that's where he says labor is part of capital because labor produces capital. The ideal is a man begins a prudent, penniless beggar, works for wages a while, then goes off to buy his own land and becomes truly free. Right. So it's clear you have articulation. Wage labor is unfree. It should be a temporary condition. True freedom is control over your own labor. But he's talking to a bunch of farmers and articulating their ideal back to them, which isn't socialism. I mean, it's not. And it's not socialism because it's not an ideal of freedom in which the way each person becomes free is through the collective control over the process of labor. It's individuated. It's based on sort of small-scale farming. And I think the really important thing, and, when Matt writes the book, then we get to find out how it happens, is that what Civil War achieves is abolition, but the meaning of abolition is indeterminate because it only tells you what you're negating, which is chattel slavery. But the contest was, what is it that you're putting in its place? What is freedom? It was just inadequate to say freedom is the absence of chattel slavery because there were a range of possible ways of organizing the economy. And the real question was, is freedom compatible with just owning your own capacity to labor such that you can make whatever labor contract you want? Or is it control over your own labor activity? And if it's control over your own activity, is it control through individual decisions about what you're going to do on your own plot of land? Or is it through collective control of an industrial process? So I think that Lincoln just doesn't, he doesn't have to directly confront those questions because he doesn't really live to see them be the central and dominant theme, which is what it really eventually comes post-war. I'll just say one little historiographical thing, which I know Matt knows too, which is that one of the people that Lincoln undoubtedly read for a decade before becoming president was Marx. Marx was one of the most consistent contributors to the New York Daily Tribune, which was basically the in-house paper of the Republican Party, and every major Republican politician would have been reading. And it was Marx, or occasionally ghostwritten by Engels. So a lot of the ideas wouldn't have just been in the air through native socialism, but would have just been there. And the kinds of ideas about freedom and free labor that were just sort of common discursive features of Republican ideology, but they were all mixed up because the conflict over different ways of thinking about what control and freedom meant in a in an industrial economy just hadn't fully developed. And so we can't, as I think that's why, as Matt says, we can't exactly say it's neither predetermined that it was going to end up in a kind of libertarian ideology, nor was it secretly and truly socialist. I think other conflicts have to develop before we can understand more precisely what these different ways of thinking about freedom and control and labor really meant and who was on which side.
Yeah, and the period, and I'll just add to that just quickly, in the period of the 1840s, 50s, the kind of ideological, sort of, ooze between, Jeffersonian republicanism and kind of, Fourier and socialism is, really messy. And then, you throw in a kind of, what Horace Greeley called Whig socialism, too. Which got a lot of love in that same paper in the 1840s, and you have all sorts of these strange correspondences that are misleading if you think of socialism and the Republican Party as being frozen in amber in say the 1890s. But the guy who named the Republican Party, Alvin Beauvais in Wisconsin,
right,
had been a communitarian socialist. So it is confusing. I mean, I think Alex's distinction is the critical one in terms of Lincoln's view about individual petty proprietorship versus kind of collective decision making on the economy, and that's where most of the kind of mainline Republicans never broke the seal on in their kind of public politics on that kind of Jeffersonian individualistic kind of vision. But it is sort of important to remember, and as a that's not there's not a straight line between that and kind of Reaganism either. It's a deeply egalitarian vision, in my view. It's obviously racialized and dependent on all sorts of land theft and problematic in lots of ways, but it has a kind of egalitarian aspiration at its core that I think is very different from libertarianism, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, as I was listening to Alex talk about that, I mean, something that hit me is that there is like a weird little echo of that view that Lincoln is presenting to the farmers that you get in contemporary right-wing politics. I'm sure, like Rob as a lefty, economist, I'm sure you run into this, not necessarily from economists, but just from like ordinary people, which is that people will say things like, well, sure, you can't live on the minimum wage, but that's not supposed to be, something you can live on, right? That's not supposed to be for, adults who are supporting families. This is supposed to be like entry level, early stuff that, which of course is in the contemporary context, like really delusionally, disconnected, from how the economy actually works. But there's like a little there is like an interesting little hint there of that same, in Lincoln's case, not necessarily a concession to socialism, but from that same maybe common starting point that you might have with socialists. Obviously much stronger in Lincoln's case, because I think even people who say it about the minimum wage don't really think that everybody's going to get to be a small proprietor someday. They just think that you're going to have a better job, but you're at least conceding that it would be unreasonable in some way to expect people to live their entire lives like this, in the same way that Lincoln's way of presenting this is conceding this like extremely radical thing, as Alex says, way to the left of anything that, Bernie or any of those people would say now, right? Which is that it's that you're fundamentally unfree if you are living your entire life as a wage laborer.
Yeah, and it's real interesting too, because despite how much these parties, like you guys are saying, have completely transformed over the intervening century and a half, I mean, like a lot of these same patterns are still there. And that's fascinating what Alex was saying. I always think one of the most interesting things is seeing how like different kinds of elite people sort of rationalize their power or their system of rule. It's always just kind of a little interesting thing. And that's really interesting. I got to say, I got to read these books. This is pretty juicy stuff. But it seems even up to today, when you look at powerful people or conservatives who don't want big government or taxation or regulation or redistribution or whatever it is, it's always like, well, that intrudes on my freedom. What about my freedom to decide what my workers will pay, or what humiliating humiliating terms I'll employ them under. It's always these people always say, well, I'm pro-freedom. I believe in freedom, like my freedom to do all these things. And so one thing, we look at a little bit in the history of this is that idea of hegemonic freedom. Like, yes, if you're a king and you can decide who lives and who gets their head cut off today, well, that's a lot of freedom for you. You're free to decide who lives and who dies. How exciting. But of course, that's just a naked abuse of power over every other human in your fiefdom or whatever it is. So it's interesting because that same sort of, like these slave owners are saying, like, well, real freedom is you concede your will and your life to us, at least, you not white people who don't have the ability to have, yes, the Jeffersonian independent agrarian ideal that we pretend that we're striving for. So this is real freedom, is me having power over you. That's incredible because that has not changed, at least. I mean, now it's just a straight capitalist dystopia century and a half later, but it's impressive how much that same sort of rationalization still happens. And also get to what Matt was saying about, that is funny. You always see those sort of distorted seeming or decontextualized Lincoln quotes, which are impressive. I mean, they show you how much people took for granted, like the dignity and role of labor, at least at that time. Although, like any other political figure, probably varying depending on the audience that he's speaking to.